Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jess, and today we're going to be talking about racial trauma, moving towards healing and solidarity. Um, just a couple of things before we get started. Officially, you will all be getting a copy of the slides. No, sorry, you'll all be getting a copy of the recording, which comes with the slides. And as we go through some of the content, if you have any questions, please feel free to click on the Q&A button and ask your questions there. And so before we start any of our sessions, we always start off with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. And the land acknowledgement that I am going to read you was actually something that we developed with an Indigenous elder. So we want to start off today by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we're on as a way to express gratitude and appreciation to those territories that we're residing on, and as a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on our land since time immemorial. It's important that we understand the longstanding history that's brought us here and seek to understand our place within that history, whether we came here by choice or we were forcefully brought to this country. And so I want to start off by saying that Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwekma, the Ohlone, the Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish territories. And it's critical that we take this moment to recognize that there's been historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous people in the Americas, which have included their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture, which unfortunately still happens today. The map that you see here actually shows you the many Indigenous tribes that were throughout the North America, as well as Alaska and Hawaii at one point in time. What we know is that there are over 100 million Indigenous people who were slaughtered in the Western Hemisphere in the past 500 years. So let's think about that. That was 100 million Indigenous people. And unfortunately today, there are only 6.8 million Indigenous folks left in the US. So we ask that you join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present, and to really think about how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. We encourage you now to honor the lands that you are on by entering their names into the chat. And if you don't know the lands that you are currently on, I'm also putting a link in the chat box for you all to look that up. We also encourage you to educate yourself about the communities who are native to your land, to share your learnings with others, and to take action to support those local Indigenous communities. Thank you to those of you who are putting the lands that you are on into the chat now. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Jess. And so we are so thankful that you've taken time out of your busy day to be with us here. You could be anywhere, but you chose to be with us in this space. So we want to welcome you, an authentic, genuine welcome from Healing Equity United to you. We welcome people of all genders. This may include people who are women, men, trans, genderqueer, or others. We welcome people who are of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islander, European descent. We welcome those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descent. We welcome all of the languages that you might speak: Spanish, English, indigenous languages, sign language, etc. We welcome people of different class backgrounds: working class, middle class, owning class, or those of us who aren't sure where we might fit on the class spectrum. We welcome people who are currently struggling to get access to resources necessary for survival, like affordable housing, healthcare, childcare, reliable transportation, and people who currently have more access to those resources. We welcome people with disabilities, invisible or visible. We welcome people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels may fit. We welcome your bodies and the different ways that you might use and experience yours. That might include chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome people who identify as activists and those who do not. We welcome the single, the married, the partnered, the dating, those in monogamous relationships and those in polyamorous relationships, those who are sexually active and those who are not, those who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. We welcome your range of emotion, joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment. We welcome those with different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to a tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. And last but not least, we welcome people who have been in sessions like these before and those who have not. So most sincerely from Healing Equity United to each and every one of you, welcome, welcome, welcome.
We also want to take this moment to say that each year Americans observe National Hispanic Heritage Month from the 15th of September to the 15th of October by celebrating the histories, cultures, and contributions of American citizens whose ancestors came from Mexico, the Caribbean, Spain, and Central and South America. The celebration begins in the middle of September as it coincides with several Latin American National Independence Day. So the 15th for Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, 16th for Mexico, the 18th for Chile, and the 21st for Belize. People celebrate nationwide through festivals, parades, art shows, conferences, community gatherings, and much more. And so we encourage you to find ways to be allies and co-conspirators to the Latine Hispanic community and to learn more about their culture and their people. I'm also going to drop some links into the chat for you all, for you to look that up if you're interested in learning more.
So my name is Fiona Oliphant, and what we do, and I hope that you are feeling this, is that we bring a lot of our identities, our emotions into the space, and we want everyone to feel like they belong in the space. So I'm going to share some of the identities that I bring into this space, and they are represented by what you see on the screen. I'm a Jamaican American first generation immigrant. So my folks are all from Jamaica. People range from being completely undocumented to naturalized citizens. And so I've seen and lived firsthand the oppressions and types of oppression that immigrant folks, especially those without documentation, face in this society. Having said that, I'm a US citizen, and there's a lot of power and privilege in that identity, and I have to recognize that. And always ask myself how I might be in better solidarity with immigrant communities. And always be mindful of how I'm showing up as a US citizen, given that powerful identity. Underneath the American flag, you'll see scales of justice. I'm a lawyer barred in DC and New York. And even though I don't currently practice law, I have to recognize that my ability to put ESQ behind my last name grants me a significant amount of power and privilege in that in the same space, in some spaces in which I would be ignored, marginalized, invisible, that when they find out that I'm an attorney, suddenly my life experiences and my perspectives and my suggestions, my voice has more value and credibility. I'm from the South Bronx of New York City, a community that is primarily Black and Brown, has higher rates of poverty, violence, of all kinds of issues and higher rates of love and support to help make me who I am today. Last but not least, for this purposes, I'm married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. Talk about the fact that his immigration story significantly differs from everybody else in my family's, and his white maleness, of course. We have three biracial children, half Black, half white. My eldest child identifies as a Black woman with a white father.
And so, hi, everybody. I'm Jess, she, series pronouns. I identify as a first generation immigrant who was born in the British colony of Hong Kong. My parents and I immigrated to New York City when I was about 4 years old. They didn't speak any English, didn't have anything beyond a third grade education. My dad swears that he didn't get any education after kindergarten. And they worked blue collar jobs. My mom was a seamstress. My dad worked overnights cleaning commercial kitchens of restaurants. And I took ESL in elementary school. As soon as I learned enough English, I became the de facto interpreter for my parents, and that's still something that I do today. Being bilingual is an identity that I realized is rooted in privilege, even though I didn't think that when I was a little kid. Currently, I live in Oakland, California. And what's interesting is that when I moved from New York City to Oakland, I felt my privilege as an Asian American increase solely because we have more Asian Americans in the Bay Area, and we have more political power out here than when I was growing up in New York. I live here with my partner who identifies as a cisgender, second generation Asian American man who grew up in an upper class neighborhood. And so we have a lot of conversations about socioeconomic class and immigration. He's also a community organizer working on civic engagement throughout the state of California. We have two dogs. Hanson, who is pictured above, is my service animal because I live with an invisible disability, even though a lot of people don't know that because I'm high functioning. And that in itself can be an identity that is rooted in privilege or oppression, depending on the spaces that I'm in. And Kobe, the dog below, is my pandemic puppy. So that's a little bit about us. But also, I just want to tell you a little bit about Healing Equity United. So Healing Equity United was founded by myself and Fiona about 5 years ago, when after many years of working in the nonprofit sector, we realized that a lot of the systemic changes that we wanted to happen were not actually changing. And so we came together to essentially work with nonprofit organizations that are really focused on transforming their organizations to be both anti-racist as well as anti-oppressive. And some of the work that we do include providing direct consulting. We also offer executive coaching as well as auditing organizations to see where they are and action planning. And as part of our work and our way of giving back to the community, we also host free webinars like this. And so for today, we are really focusing on discussing, what is race-based trauma? How does it impact individuals and our community? What are some ways that we might be able to identify positive coping mechanisms? And how do we manage some racial trauma responses that come up for ourselves and for others in our workplace? And essentially, what are some actions and next steps that you can take towards healing and building solidarity? And because we want to make sure that we are all, interacting with one another in the chat and with you as well, we do have some group agreements that we're going to ask that we follow during the course of this webinar.
Thank you. So even though you're just participating, and I say just with air quotes around it, just participating via chat, and this is a more passive receptive version of this conversation, we wanted to ensure that we're not going to engage in the oppression Olympics in this space, right? So we're going to respect people's different identities and lived experiences. We're not going to try to one up each other in terms of who has faced more or what type of oppression. This will be a brave space, hopefully, not necessarily a safe space. We can't guarantee that harm won't come into the space, even via the chat, right? But be vulnerable, be brave. But if you recognize that you've caused harm, to take accountability for that. There are going to be some challenging moments in this brief time that we have together. And be ready for that and be open to that. Please practice engaged listening, right? That means listening to cultivate an understanding. Um, Move up, move aside is even applicable in the chat. If you find that you are taking up a disproportionate amount of space, then please be mindful of that and create room for others to participate and feel like they belong as well. We're going to respect different experiences and lived experiences and different perspectives. Going to focus on our own learning. Please always address the group, not a specific individual in the group. And always take care of yourself, especially with a topic like today's. Remember to be constantly breathing in your body, checking in with yourself. And so we're just going to dive right into it. Um, Here's a quote that we thought would help to ground us in our upcoming conversation. And it's, as people of color living in America and around the world continue to be impacted by racism and racial trauma, we will need God's grace, stamina, and resilience to stay well. And I feel, at least personally, that this is a quote that really resonates with me because there's some days, y'all, you know the news. You wake up and you're like, oh, can I do it today? And what am I going to need to be able to do it today? And sometimes the answer is when I have to push pause. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So here's the definition. If you opened Webster's definition of trauma, here's what you would see, right? It's maybe an emotional wound, maybe it's a physical damage to the body. But for today's conversation, we're just going to say that trauma is a natural response to extremely distressing or disturbing events. Now, neither Jess nor I are psychologists or doctors, but we have had decades of work in the anti-gender based violence space in which we've had to really have robust conversations around trauma and the very types of trauma and how to interrupt trauma and preempt trauma. And so that's where we are going to be coming from in terms of our experiences with unpacking trauma, and more importantly for us, moving from trauma into healing and solidarity. So here are varied types of trauma. As from the definition in Webster's, the first thing that they talked about was like a physical trauma, right? And that can be even in a serious fall and breaking a bone, or being in a car accident, or, you know, other types of assaults to the body, right? That can be very jarring and can have a physical impact in terms of the trauma, but also the emotional and psychological impact of the trauma. Another type of trauma is secondary trauma. Some people also call it vicarious trauma. It is when something harmful or distressing or out of the ordinary happens to someone else, but because you are hearing it, you are seeing it, you are repeatedly being exposed to it, that you start to internalize that trauma and feel as if it were your own. And I want to really highlight this point that secondary trauma is no less painful, right? Because it really does have an impact on your body, on your psyche, on your emotions. And we're going to talk about what that might look like in a minute. But I don't want to belittle secondary trauma just because it's vicarious, right? And it's not a first person experience. There's also political and societal trauma. Whew, if we wanted to open that can of worms, we would be here for many, many, many hours together. But anything from our political discourse to what is happening to in our communities in terms of poverty, in terms of lack of access to necessary resources for survival. There's a whole lot of trauma that's associated with that. Environmental trauma. I feel like we are experiencing that weekly, right? We came out of, quote unquote, out of the pandemic, right? We have wildfires blazing everywhere we turn. We have droughts. We have all kinds of um, environmental changes that we have to recognize not only are hurting our environment, but are hurting us as well in terms of what we are internalizing with our psyches. There's also intergenerational trauma, right? And as an attorney, I like to read the books, I like the data. And I was a little skeptical about this one, right? But there's research that shows that the trauma of our ancestors are actually carried in our DNA, right? So some researchers indicate that trauma is passed down from one generation to another and absorbed into our bodies, right? Um, and if anybody else is interested in that, we can certainly give you some links to that when we send you the recording and the slides. But what we wanted to particularly focus on today was racialized trauma. Now, racialized trauma is something that is didn't have words, but Jess is going to talk to you about it.
And so racialized trauma is something that was recognized officially in the field of psychology in the last couple of years. And it's essentially what's written here, which is, I'll read it for accessibility purposes: mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. Any individual that has experienced an emotionally painful, sudden, and uncontrollable racist encounter is at risk of suffering from a race-based traumatic stress injury. And so in the US, BIPOC people are most vulnerable due to living under a system of white supremacy. And so we can think about that in terms of like what causes racialized trauma, right? And we know that sometimes it's the policing, it's the nonstop shooting of Black and brown folks in our community. It can look like being bullied at work. It can also, look like being gaslit and being told that certain things that you're experiencing or feeling is not actually happening. And so I think it's important for us to really think about how racialized trauma manifests, right? So it can manifest in the body. It can show up as, for example, what I found out a couple of years ago is that if you go to the ER, a majority of people in the ER who come in for any gastrointestinal issues, it's often due to stress. So it could be race-based traumatic stress, or it's due to trauma. It's not because of food poisoning or other things that may be happening. A large majority of the cases in ER is due to that. It can also manifest in terms of headaches and migraines or exhaustion, right? If we are at work and every single day we're experiencing racial trauma, then the reality is that we might be emotionally exhausted, and that translates into physical exhaustion as well. And it can also manifest in the mind, for some of us, when we go through certain incidences, we're sitting there questioning ourselves, like, did this really happen? Did what I imagined really happen? Feeling like we are unable to really grasp the reality of the situation because we're constantly being challenged on what our reality actually is. It can also show up in social interactions with one another. So Fiona, can you give an example of how this might show up in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually thinking of recent studies that have shown as more and more organizations are going back to quote unquote back to the office or back to work, um, and there are hybrid options, or now more and more nonprofits that are offering completely remote offerings and positions, that there is data that indicates that folks of color are flocking to the positions that are either remote or allow for hybrid um, options. Why? Because it limits the social interactions that are usually laden with microaggressions and pain and harmful in the workplace, of being constantly all of the things that Jess said. I won't repeat them here, but I think that's like the social interactions that come up for me when you ask for example, like simply going into the office and saying, okay, I have to show up as a less than complete version of myself, and I have to put my shield and armor on in order to make it through this space today.
Yeah, and so we also invite you to share in the chat if you can think of other examples of how racialized trauma might manifest, whether it's in your personal lives and in your interactions with other folks, or even in the workplace. So we invite you to share some of those examples in the chat, because one of the things that we're going to go into next is really thinking about like, what is racial solidarity? What is radical healing for racial trauma? And what shows up when we don't have racial solidarity. So we're going to share with you a theory that Fiona and I came up with, which is, on the left, you will see a racial hierarchy that was developed in the United States in the 1960s that essentially put white people at the top, with Black and African people, African and African Americans at the bottom of this racial hierarchical triangle. And we know that this is kind of a fluid thing in terms of, depending on what's happening in the country, certain people may move up or down on that racial hierarchy scale, but essentially white folks in this country have always been at the top of a racial hierarchy scale. Now, one of the theories that Fiona and I came up with is that because of the oppression Olympics, that there's actually a wall for all of us. And there's a push for us internally to try to move towards whiteness, right? That's what we're taught. Like the white is right. These are the best practices, right? And depending on how we engage with one another, we may be closer to to breaking through that wall and or not, right? And so Fiona, can you talk a little bit about like what are in the speech bubbles, like in whiteness, like how does the oppression Olympics manifest?
Absolutely, Jess. Thank you. So, in terms of how it manifests in our society, I think that we even have to take um, some reflection and time backward of like, how have we internalized systems of oppression, particularly racialized oppression, and how have we internalized it even as folks of color against other folks of color. And so in the thought bubble, it might say, you know, all Black folks are criminals, and all of these people are not hardworking, and all of those people are model minorities. And it is something that, even though some of us might have identities that say that we are people of the global majority, we may have absorbed some of these negative commentaries and narratives like a sponge in the ocean, um, and taken them on as our own, and even use them against some people in our own community. I'll give you one quick example, and please don't hate on my mom. She was of a different generation, but she was Jamaican, and she was in Jamaican in an era of under colonialism, right? And so there was a lot of internalized harmful narratives about Black folks in America. So I distinctly remember my mom telling me not to be like those Black children in school. And that would confuse me because I would look in the mirror and I would see a Black child, right? Like, uh, what exactly is she talking about? In hindsight, what I recognized that she was talking about is that she had internalized those um, colonialist narratives and those horrible anti-Black narratives about Black folk in America not being as hardworking as, say, for example, Jamaicans, or not being as dedicated to education as, say, Jamaicans, right? And so that is just one example, Jess. I know that was far longer than you wanted, but anyway, go ahead.
Thank you, Fiona. And so why are we talking about this, right? And so one of the things that we want to talk about is really thinking about like where are we on this particular scale, right? For those of us who identify as BIPOC, or, we have to recognize that there's been a lot of trauma, in coming to this country, right? Whether we're forcefully brought here, or we are refugees, or we decided to immigrate here, our ancestors did. But that, as Fiona shared earlier, that trauma is carried through our DNA. And so when we are engaging and interacting with other folks, like, are we engaging and interacting with them from a space of trauma or from a space of healing, right? So during the pandemic in my community, in my East Asian American community, there was a lot of conflict, because our businesses were being attacked in Oakland, Chinatown, because our elders were being beaten all over the country. And I'm going to be honest that in some of the conversations that I had with my community, there was a lot of us versus them narrative, right? And really that came from like the trauma of watching what happened to their relatives. It also came from, the trauma that they carried with them when they came into this country. And so it was like, well, it's really about us. We have to survive. And in order for us to survive, we have to be against others, right? Not saying that I agree with that, but that was the conversations that were in my community. And so for us, it's really important that we work to move towards spaces of healing. And so we're going to be getting into that in the next part. So I'm going to pass it back over to Fiona to talk a little bit about radical healing.
Thank you, Jess. And so we're trying to cram as much information in as possible. We could spend hours and hours going into further detail about this and the varied types of racialized trauma that's experienced. But radical healing and moving towards that from racialized trauma is really about being whole in the face of identity-based wounds. Those identity-based wounds that are rooted in how others treat you due to your membership in a specifically oppressed racial group or ethnic group. And it involves personal and collective action that promotes living a life with dignity and respect. What I really love about the notion of radical healing is that it's not, oh, I'm going to go get a manicure or a pedicure. It's not that I'm going to go for a yoga session. No shade to yoga, right? But it is not that I'm going to go get a massage. It is about something that is deeper, something that is going to be a touchstone when all of those other sort of like self-care healing practices aren't going to be enough to address or mitigate or be a salve to the wound of the daily types of abuse um, and pains that people of the global majority experience. And so, what can we do? So, we work in nonprofit organizations, right? We have a couple of different things we believe that we can do as individuals, right? But also as colleagues, and then finally as organizations. And so I'm going to go through some of these. As individuals, we can try to incorporate and be really honest about the radical healing that we need for ourselves, right? Um, and it's not going to be the same for everyone. Is it going to be journaling? Is it going to be mindfulness and meditation? Is it going to be energy healing? Is it going to be going for long walks or long drives? Or is it going to be being out in nature, right? Is it going to be practicing acts of service to give back to the community? What is it that we can do as individuals that are healing for us, right? For no one else. It pleases no one else. And I will say one really important piece of healing that's been crucial for me is a daily conversation with myself about, like, first of all, imposter syndrome and not listening to my own voice. Um, Another one is around being able to say no, and that no is a complete statement. It doesn't need any explanation. It doesn't need us to feel badly about not bending over backwards to fit somebody else's needs. And interpersonally is showing up for other people um, in a way that recognizes our own stuff, right? So noticing the signs in our own body, in our own thoughts. We often say in the anti-domestic violence sexual assault space, like, and the trauma space, like, hurt people, right? So if I am lashing out in anger at people, or others are lashing out in anger at me, right? How might that be rooted in the racialized trauma that they have experienced? And how can we shift that in order to focus on healing? We shouldn't be putting the burden of fixing racism on folks of the global majority, right? That's not healing. That is actually more stressful, right? We can work in collaboration with those who I've, without coercion, identified that they want to work on these issues, but we shouldn't be saying, oh, this is a people of color thing to solve. And then focusing lastly on what we as organizations can do to promote radical healing, creating healing spaces at work. So I'll give a couple of examples, and Jess, I want you to put on your thinking cap about this. But we know organizations that have sought funding that does not impose on any other organizational funding, but has sought funding specifically to engage radical healers for all of their staff, right? If something comes up for a person on staff, they can go to this said radical healer, energy healer in the community. The organization doesn't have to know who it is, how long they were there for, but the organization pays because they have specifically sought funding to do so. We have seen organizations that specifically incorporate wellness days, either monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly. So we don't have to call in with that 24-hour cold or bug. It is, we know that that just showing up is hard. And so we are encouraging you and holding you accountable for taking this wellness day just for you so that you can refill your own cup. We have known organizations that have created spaces for racialized caucusing so that folks can not feel like whenever they're coming together that everybody else is like, why are they all, what are they doing, right? But that there is a brave and safe space just for folks to go to share the experiences that they've had. And Jess, what about psychological safety or any other organizational examples that you might have?
Yeah, and I also want to encourage those of you on this to really, share what some of your organizations might be doing, or what some of you might be doing as well, to foster healing in your organizations. I mean, really, some of the things that I know that organizations have been doing is looking at creating retreat spaces for and that's separated through the different employee resource groups, racial caucusing. Others will bring in, and this is more in the domestic violence, human trafficking field that I worked in. Really, in terms of fostering psychological safety, they have clinicians who come in who specifically work with the staff on processing things that they're hearing and that they are feeling. And these clinicians aren't there because the staff need the hours or they're trying to earn a certificate. It's really for the staff themselves. And all of that is kept confidential from their supervisors. What we've also seen organizations do is close for a couple of weeks. I think before the pandemic, closing for a week in the summer was not really a thing. Maybe people had Fridays off, but closing for a week or two in the summer is something that is we're seeing more and more in the last year. And I know, for Healing Equity United, we try to close for a week every quarter. Other organizations have moved to unlimited paid time off, or racial healing days for BIPOC staff who might need it after witnessing an event. We've also seen organizations that have, because of how hard it is right now to recruit high quality employees, so it is kind of for economic reasons, but we have seen organizations move to 4-day work weeks. Or more flex hours for their staff. And really what we want to think about is not just our own individual healing and the healing of BIPOC communities, but how does our organization begin to cultivate a culture of healing? What does it look like? What would it look like if we started from the space of healing and then filtered it out throughout the rest of the work that we do? And so that's something that I'm going to challenge you all to really be thinking about, as we go through. And so I'm going to pass it back over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Jess. And so I wanted to ask y'all in the chat. I'm seeing some folks put into the chat some of the things that their organizations would do. We wanted to, like, if, and we know this is challenging, if we could reimagine our nonprofit organizations as spaces rooted in healing and community care, as opposed to spaces rooted in achieving the deliverables and making sure that action plan is checked off, that to-do list is checked off, what would our organizations look like? What would our spaces look like? So I'm going to give y'all a couple of moments to think about that and put that in the chat. We've given you a head start in some things that we've seen. Put some more in the chat. And just PJ, if any of those are coming in that are missing that you want to pull
Yeah,
out.
I'm going to read it for accessibility purposes. Someone mentioned that their current organization offers an individual budget for wellness, childcare, professional personal development for each employee, having flex hours and 2 weeks off around the holidays. So that was one of the ideas. And what came up for me as I was going through that was also thinking about organizations that are moving towards trying to pay a more livable wage. Honestly, the last time I was an executive director was in 2016. 2016, 2017, something like that. I try to forget those days because it was really hard. But what I can tell you is that the salaries for particularly the executive and managerial positions in the nonprofit sector have really increased over the past 2 to 3 years. Now, I think we still have some work to do on our frontline staff, but I do see that there are more organizations partaking in either trainings or hiring a consultant to be like, how do we ensure that our staff are being paid a livable wage? And so that's something to consider as well, because that is tied to our wellness and our healing. If we're worried about how we're going to pay our bills, or if we have to work multiple jobs in order to afford to work at our nonprofit job, that's not cultivating healing. That's actually cultivating stress. Others mentioned that they moved to a 35-hour work week. I think the Europeans studies were right in that we should be moving. In the US, we work more hours than lots of places around the world, I think with the exception of maybe Japan. But I do think there's something to be said about having a shorter work week. And some of the studies have shown that it actually increases productivity. Another one is childcare assistance is huge. Experience is that before and after school programs don't have as many slots for kids since the pandemic. That's affected their child. Any help with childcare would be a huge relief. Absolutely. If organizations were cultivating healing, it would be life-changing and more person-centered. This would help everyone aim to be the best starting from the inside. Lightening the load of the work and understanding that only so much can be done in the amount of hours that we have or number of employees that the organization has. Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because one of the things that I talk about is that a lot of the issues that our organization works on are issues that are going to unfortunately exist beyond our lifetimes, right? You know, I've worked in the domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking space for almost 20 years. And I know that those issues are not going to be resolved in my lifetime. I would love for it to end now, to end right this minute, but I know that it's not going to continue. And so for many of us, it's really thinking about how do we sustain ourselves so that we can continue doing this work tomorrow, next week? How do we show the next generation of younger leaders that this work can be sustainable? And I think that that's something that's really important to think about in terms of our sector. And, you know, I also saw another comment that came in looking at, you know, trying to educate folks on the importance of diversity and communication. That's definitely one. I know that addressing neurodiversity is one of the issues that has been coming up more often. The other thing around that is also we've seen a lot of mental health issues as a result of the pandemic and the ongoing issues that are happening in our communities, right? And so can our organizations provide some sort of stipend for mental health care, knowing that in certain parts of the country, we have, unfortunately, therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists who do not accept insurance, right? Another thing, and Fiona loves it when I talk about my dogs, but I have seen more and more organizations have these therapy dog days where they bring in therapy dogs, either not just for the people that they're working with, but for staff as well after a major incident has happened. Particularly, I've seen them in the aftermath of, unfortunately, school shootings, but also things that have happened in local communities. And so I hope that we've given you a good number of examples. But also, you know, having you all share with the chat is great. And the chat is great. I think those are really good examples as well. And so we wanted to open it up for any questions that you might have at this point. Feel free to put them in the chat. You can also put them in the Q&A, but just any questions that you all might have about, you know, how do we implement a culture of healing, or, you know, how do we address racial trauma? So we want to open it up to you all at this moment for that.
And just as we wait for questions to come in, I want to anticipate one question that we usually get when we have this conversation. How are we going to pay for this? I would love to do this, but it's completely impossible because, funding is limited, right? So what we say is that we have to um, demand it, right? In terms of telling funders why this funding is necessary. And we have to start incorporating it into all of our grant proposals, right? And how you incorporate it, I'll just give you a free tip. How you incorporate it into your grant proposals is you say, and this line item is crucial for staff retention. And you provide data. If we don't support staff in terms of community care and radical healing spaces, we lose staff at a rate of blank percent. When we start to incorporate these practices, we have found that we've retained staff at a rate of blank percent. We are saving blank thousands of dollars and numbers of hours in terms of recruiting, constantly recruiting, in terms of constantly onboarding, right? And you argue that case to the funders about why this is crucial. This is not something that is ancillary. This is not something that is, the cherry on the sundae. It is the sundae. We have to make our spaces of work where we do such crucial work, spaces of healing so that we can do the work. Any questions coming in, Jess?
Yeah, so there's a question that came in. How can healing be promoted between staff and leadership when trust has been broken?
Wow, that's a big one to start off with. Look, well, that's another whole conversation, but I'll just give the quick answer is um I wouldn't even start talking about healing if the trust has already been broken. What I would talk about first is demonstrating change and a commitment to change and a commitment to accountability and owning the harm that has occurred, being transparent about it, and start demonstrating change behavior. And slowly but surely, after that model, that exemplification and telegraphing of the change, then you can start to rebuild trust. And then you can start to move towards healing. I don't know if you have a different opinion, Jess.
No, I think that's, yeah, I agree with you on that. Okay, this next question, I feel like it came in through the Q&A, and I feel like you put this question in, Fiona, or you, because I feel like you're gonna love this question. So, do you have any book recommendations to start uncovering and unlearning that internalized racism we all have? I'm gonna pass this over to you because Fiona is the book nerd.
Oh my goodness. The internalized racism. There are so many books. It just makes fun of me because I actually have a Bookstagram account about these books. So one is uh, Me and White Supremacy. And even though the target audience, and that's by Layla Saad, even though the target audience is white folks, I felt that as a person of color, if you want to like unpack any ways that you might have unintentionally internalized that white supremacist narrative or culture, it is a good way to start dealing with that. My grandmother's hands, of course, is always one that's great for healing. Um, all the internalized ones. Of course, Ibram Kendi's books, not the 7,000 page one because stand from the beginning. Um, but let's see. You know what? I can give you a list.
It's on our website. If you go to our website and you click on resources, there's a list of different books that are on there, including the ones that PJ just put in the chat for you all. And then last question, how do you reconcile racial trauma inflicted by another BIPOC person who has power over you in a work environment? Because it's another POC, it made it sound much more painful and damaging as it colluded with white leadership.
That is a hard one. That is a hard one. And I will tell you, I'm an older, I have poor lighting right now, but I'm of an older generation in which, a lot of people of the global majority had told themselves, I have to um, internalize and be bound by these white supremacist norms in order to succeed. And that my proximity to whiteness will allow me to reap the benefits of that. And consequently, I'm going to behave in a way that colludes with and continues to oppress other folks of the global majority. And I will say that was always painful back in the day. Now, as I've gotten older, and I know that this is it is a privilege that I have, that I can now call it out for what it is, that I no longer have to tolerate it. I don't have to be rude about it, but I don't have to tolerate that. If it is a power mitigation situation, what I always tell folks is, let's have the conversation as an organization. But quite honestly, if folks of the global majority who are in positions of power, who have internalized white supremacist norms and are refusing to change their behavior or even engage in self-reflection, we don't have to tolerate it. Take it elsewhere. You have the power to leave. You have the power to find spaces where diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, community care, radical healing is prioritized.
Thank you, Fiona. And so we want to thank you all for joining us today. We also wanted to invite you, and I'll put this in the chat for you all. If you're interested in reading and learning more, we do have a book babble that is going to be led by Fiona on Inventing Latinos, a new story of American racism. We have a book babble that's coming up next week if you would like to join us. Yeah, and if you need additional questions, we'll we'll get back to you if you email us through the link. Thank you all so much for joining.